I don't know about you, but given the events of just, let's take the last month in this country and abroad, I really needed this conference. And despite the challenges of the whole thing, so I hope you two are feeling the force and the lift of coming together as a community and engaging in conversation and being in an open-minded space and giving ourselves to the stories that unite us. So thank you for that. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists and myself. I wasn't originally going to be on this panel, so that will be a very brief introduction. But this is a great crowd, and I want to start with our moderator, Pamela Paul. You will have read her in the New York Times, where she's an opinion columnist. She was, of course, the editor of the Book Review for a decade and did a fantastic job there. She's also an author, written 8 books, the most recent of which is 100, sorry.
You've lost it to the internet. It's 100 things
you lost to the internet.
Yes.
Exactly.
Including our memory.
Right.
Yes.
I am, yes. I am the meme for Pamela's book. Abraham Verghese, just incredibly dear friend of mine. I don't need to say very much to this audience, I'm sure. You've read Cutting for Stone. You've read more recently The Covenant of Water. Together, they have sold, I've lost count how many millions of copies. He's also, of course, a great nonfiction writer and a beloved doctor in the world who talks about healing and story. And it's a great honor to have him back here to be a part of this. And then right next to me, another person who needs very little introduction, KRISTIN HANNAH. And you know, KRISTIN has actually written 20 books, but in the last, half decade or more, she has produced books that every one of you will know. Most of them have been #1 on the Times bestseller list, like The Women, which has been sitting at #1 now for months and will be forever. It is a wonderful book. It is a powerful book. We'll be hearing about that now, but she's also written The Four Winds, The Nightingale, and many others. And she's really just a remarkable storyteller, and I'm also delighted to say a wonderful person. Oh. So that's our panel, and we are going to dive into, with Pamela's guidance, the subject of historical fiction and investigating the past.
Thank you, John. Thank you. So I have a confession to make, which is that for a long time, I really bristled at the notion of historical fiction. I had this incredibly rigid, puritanical view that there's history over here and there's fiction over here, and I didn't want to mess with what actually happened, with what someone imagined might have happened. And, there are many people who have this kind of notion, especially historians. Antonia Fraser once said, "I can't read historical fiction because I find the real thing more interesting." Which raises the question, right, what is the real thing? And then I also thought historical fiction was somehow kind of cheesy. I had worked at a B. Dalton, if you remember that, speaking of ancient history, now part of the Barnes & Noble empire, when I was in high school, and I thought of historical fiction as mass market paperbacks on a spinning rack where there were scheming princesses and lots of sword play, and I just thought, no thank you. So in other words, I was a complete idiot. I had no idea what I was missing. Hilary Mantel, I have to say, helped change my mind. And she once said, "People who wrote literary novels about the past probably don't want them pegged as historical fiction." Certainly that's true in England. I think that Hilary Mantel went a long way towards dismantling that prejudice. Now, of course, I see no difference no conflict between history and fiction, because what historical fiction does that's so so effective is that it is entirely transportative. And what more could we want from a novel? And I'll just quote one other historical fiction novelist, who I think you've probably all read, Geraldine Brooks. She said, "The thing that most attracts me to historical fiction is taking the factual record as far as it is known, using that as scaffolding, and then letting imagination build the structure that fills in those things we can never find out for sure." And I think she got that exactly right. That said, I'm not entirely sure what we mean by historical fiction. So I want to throw that idea, that question out to you. How do you think of historical fiction? And do you think of yourself as writing historical fiction? Yeah?
So, I was surprised to be invited to be on this panel because I haven't been thinking of my work as historical fiction. But I suppose almost any work of fiction that looks at the past is in a sense historical. I think the most liberal interpretation for me of historical fiction is almost like a procedural. You're setting the story not in a hospital, not in a police station, but this in a particular time period. But you need all the details to be just right. That is the liberal interpretation. But there's also a dark side to this, which is, we might get into that, and that is historical fiction can hopelessly bias us. There's a whole library of colonial literature that painted a very rosy view of imperialism and colonialism, really not authentic to the lived experience of, say, Indians colonized by the British for 150 years. So, there are aspects to it that can be very dark, but overall, I'm very receptive to the idea. There's a great line in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by the chief, and he says, "It's the truth, even if it didn't happen."
Oh, that's excellent.
And I would say that, when we write, setting it in a particular period, it's the truth, and perhaps it did happen.
Well, I push back also, like I said yesterday, on the 1970s and 1980s being historical fiction. But that is sort of how it's defined now. If you're either writing contemporary or you're writing historical. And I would say for me, and when I moved into historical fiction, I guess 15 years ago, it was really about exactly what you're talking about. I was looking for women's history and looking, to sort of open up people's eyes, my own eyes, to what non-represented people had done in the past. And I think the most important part for me about historical fiction is to create empathy, is to put people in the shoes of people who lived before and sort of just raise awareness. And we all know that the stakes can be really high in historical fiction, and I find that to be a wonderful sort of world to work in.
I have to say, when Ayanna Mathis, who was originally on this panel, and her novel takes place in the 1980s, I was really offended.
Yeah.
I was like, no, anything that took place within my lifetime is not history. It's now.
That's what I said, exactly.
I mean, when I started thinking about both the novels of mine that would be called historical, The Commoner and The Red Daughter, it was the last thing on my mind to think about whether it was a part of history or where it sat. It was a story that I heard about that moment, and that opened up to me the same kinds of questions and desire to investigate that I would have over any novel. I am, skeptical, I think, about history to some degree in the first place, which is to say, 99% of all evidence, historical evidence, if you will, particularly unrecorded dialogue, is lost to us anyway. So there's much discussion about what history actually is. I also am a big believer in the fictions of our own selves. Memory obviously being one of those, and I think it was Hilary Mantel who said, when you die, you become a fiction. You become a fiction, in that sense, in that your story is already being told. And so, as Abraham said, most of the novels that we think of as great were already, in their own time, historical novels. Whether it was Tolstoy or Hawthorne, they're already looking back to try and then begin to retelling that in order to try and speak to the people of their own time. So I think the distinction is becoming less and less relevant, and it really becomes a literary distinction, which is to say, how is it that you are trying to tell your story? What are your standards? What are your questions about that? And I think eventually, I wouldn't be sorry if the whole category just kind of dissolved into one.
Well, it's interesting because Tolstoy, of course, and Victor Hugo both wrote what would be technically defined as historical fiction, if we use that definition of a novel taking place in the past, because, as you say, they were writing about things that had, taken place decades before they sat down to write that history. I feel like we should insert a little snippet from the musical Hamilton, right? Like, who tells your story? Because all of you touched on who is telling the story, who is overlooked, who has been left out of the narrative. And Abraham, you mentioned colonial, history, and the fact that India's history was for a long time the subject of many British novels, thinking of Rudyard Kipling, of E.M. Forster. And do you think of yourself as sort of trying to provide some kind of corrective to that view?
No, not really. I mean, my goal with every novel, and I'm speaking as though I have 20 novels. I have 2.
Yes. But you've also written some medical books.
However, they're much longer than mine. Yeah. So let's come on.
But my goal is always very simple: a good story, well told.
Yeah.
And I think that when you tap into truth, it resonates for the reader. And it makes the history real if it feels true to them. But that said, I think we should all I appreciate how much my view of, for example, the American frontier was shaped by first reading James Fenimore Cooper, or my rosy vision of the antebellum and postbellum South was shaped by Gone with the Wind. Now, was that really an accurate perception? I'm sure it wasn't. Well, similarly, I think Kim and a lot of Rudyard Kipling's work, and it was very, very popular in Britain to write about India in this romantic, rosy way, with the natives portrayed as the white man's burden. And I think there's been a whole academy that has evolved to try and correct that, the whole post-colonial literature movement trying to set right some of this. And I think a lot of great novels out there have corrected that colonial past, but it's insidious, and we shouldn't lose sight of its pernicious influence on us when it's inaccurate. I don't know if that was the question we began
No,
with.
it's interesting. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating is still today, I think, or at least until quite recently, Enid Blyton, who's like the most British of children's book authors, is as popular, if not more popular in India than she is in England. And yet, she has, there are all kinds of colonial and racist attitudes in her work.
Well, I mean, I would push back a little bit. I mean, I read Enid Blyton. I found the tales delightful. I don't think they were quite as demeaning of India as, say, some of Kipling's stuff, or Rider Haggard, again, a popular book. I read it. I don't think I understood till I was older, how it was in a way making a mockery of the very people that I come from. So it's complicated.
I always hear defenses of Enid Blyton, too, from everyone. But you, KRISTIN, you did deliberately set out to tell this story of women who were really overlooked from the historical record in Vietnam.
Well, and even before that, with the Nightingale starting, back with World War II, it just became apparent to me, I think, at a certain age. And yes, I've written a lot of novels. I started as a young mom writing novels, during nap hour. And so it took me a long time, I think, to come into my own and to understand my place in the world and what I had to say as a woman. And when I began sort of that journey of coming into my own as a writer and as a woman, that's when I looked around and realized that there was so much that I hadn't been taught in 7 years of college or whatever. There were so many of these stories I just didn't know. And the first one was, the women of the French Resistance. And it wasn't that it wasn't out there. There were memoirs and that, but it hadn't been sort of, told on a grand scale for a woman by a woman. And so the difficulty for me was, after all of those years, to sort of take the leap to say, I'm going to write a historical novel, and I'm not a historian, and so it was very daunting. But once I started writing and researching these stories that had not been told, I just got, I guess I was angry. And so that is sort of what pushed me into writing historical fiction.
John, you, in both of your historical novels, wrote about figures that we haven't heard as much from, women who were adjacent to, in some way, the major male figures of their times.
I mean, in both cases, with the Empress of Japan, the former Empress of Japan, Michiko Shoda, I remember that began for me with a story from my great aunt who had published a children's book of the Empresses in translation and had been invited to lunch at the Imperial Palace. And so she comes back from her trip, and I had majored in Japanese studies and written a novel set in Japan, and so, she knew I would be interested, and tells me a story about her lunch. And during that lunch, which was a very private lunch and very personal, she hears from the Empress about a time decades before, when she had lost her voice, basically had a nervous breakdown. And so that story, I remember where we were when she told me, and to me, it had never occurred to me that there were people in there, let alone someone who had grown up on the streets of Tokyo in a sort of normal way, and then married at 24 and crossed over into the most hermetic, most bizarre, most mysterious world, known, most sexist, and for all intents and purposes disappeared from life and would never be seen again. No memoirs, no nothing. And so the way you would with any novel, I just grabbed on it, and it was like a hand coming up out of the rubble after an earthquake, and I thought, oh my God, she's down there. And then you just begin. And in the other case, it was Stalin's daughter, and it was reading the obituary of Svetlana in 2011, and suddenly remembering it was on the front page of the Times, and I knew the story, but I hadn't thought about her in years. And my father had brought her over when she defected from Russia in 1967. And there was a picture of her on the wall of our house, and she had actually been around when I was a baby and lived with us for a while. And I just began reading about her life, and I thought, again, I was just following her life and thinking, who was she? What an incredible life, what a crazy thing. She never stopped. She never even knew if her father loved her or what that was. And so you start pulling the thread, and then, of course, research, which I don't know about you guys.
We'll get into.
Yeah, I know. As a novelist, it's so much fun.
Yeah.
But to do that, but you're doing it in a very different way. But for me, I was in it before I understood. I understood that it was a different time. Mm-hmm. But you're following the story that feels incredibly present as you're following it, and trying to understand then, what do I need to do to make this a world?
So you touched on a secret, unspoken subgenre of fiction and nonfiction, which I call the obituary book. And you'd be surprised how many authors I have interviewed whose books began with reading an obit, and including Patrick Redden Keefe, who was here last year. His book, Say Nothing, began by reading an obituary in the New York Times. Yes. But one of the things that differentiates your books, the two that you've done, historical fiction, from your two, is that, and I think of this as a big divide within historical fiction, that you can either look into very real figures from the past and tell their stories, or you can imagine people within a real past. And so both of you do have actual, real people who lived during those times kind of flit in and out of your narrative, Gandhi and Nehru, and obviously you had, I think, the Born on the 4th of July guy whose name is now escaping. He makes
Ron.
an appearance,
Yeah.
Ron. And so I'm interested in that question. Like, did you think about ever writing about real people who existed and making them your central characters? Or was the idea always to imagine wholly new characters within this historical past?
Well, for me, I think I began with the central image of my grandmothers, really unique, heroic women, but heroic in a way that the world would never know, sort of unsung heroes. And then I was setting the world around them, which included, viceroys and Gandhi and people like that, and the whole trappings of British colonialism. But I don't think I was ever interested enough in any one character at the outset, a real character. But I must say, in the course of research, I stumbled onto some really fascinating people, and so, who knows? It might be well worthwhile exploring one of their lives or one of their brains. Can I add something to something that KRISTIN said that reminded me? In the course of writing The Covenant of Water, even though my goal was a good story well told, I found myself tapping into a vein of anger because, there is this colonial history of how Britain built the railways and, built all these great institutions for India and civilized us. This is the narrative, and the true narrative, which became much more apparent during my research, was there wasn't a single railway built that wasn't to carry goods to Britain.
Right.
And for 150 years, they pillaged the country, and every large institution you see in England and Scotland is built on the wealth of slavery, on the wealth of this kind of loot. In fact, the very word loot is taken from the Indian language. And so that was clearly fueling a kind of righteous anger in one of my characters. That's not related to your question, but I think it reminded me of what made that feel powerful to me.
Well, now I'm very curious when you say you came across characters that you think, oh, maybe that would be an interesting person. Can you tell us about one of the people who you came across that you thought I would like to know more about their story, tell that story?
Well, there were a series of viceroys who were nominally the heads of the British in India, and some of them were visionary, some of them were incredibly narrow-minded. Then, of course, you had the figure of Mountbatten, and so much has been written about, Lord Mountbatten, who oversaw the eventual departure of the English and the catastrophic separation of this country into two, India and Pakistan, the largest mass migration ever seen. And we know a lot about him. We know a lot about Lady Mountbatten. We know a lot about her deep connection with Nehru, perhaps even a romance there. But there's a lot about their interior lives and their imagined lives that I think remains to be tapped into.
I guess I have never, to this point, I have never wanted to examine someone's life fully myself. I have I'm uncomfortable putting words in their mouth. I look at Eric Larson's stuff and the level of research and the level of care that you have to take, and thinking about their families and thinking about, your ability to cross that line between imagination and research. And to date, I have wanted full imagination. And I think I'm also more interested. These guys have very interesting families, I have to say. I don't have any family members out there that are, pushing me towards stories.
We can switch if you want to. You don't know the half of it.
But I think I'm more interested in ordinary people, not people in positions of power or responsibility, or people upon whom history turns. I want to know. While we were hearing about the West, we know what the men were doing, what the white men were doing, frankly. And there's so many other stories out there, and I just want to read those and tell those. And we seem to be living in the course of my career in a time where readers and writers are hungry for stories that expand the narrative and expand who we consider to be historical figures and what we consider to be historical events.
Well, it's interesting because your two figures are both, right? They're ordinary women who, by dint of marriage and birth, were elevated into these very public figures, right? Hiroko and Svetlana. But nonetheless, I have to say, like Kristin, I would find it terrifying to try to reimagine, try to fill in those gaps. What was that like?
Part of the appeal, of course, is I get interested in stories all the time, people's lives. Some of them are well known and some not. You're always just open to it and you find your pulse goes up. But then you look around and you think, well, what kind of room is there to maneuver in?
Right.
And in the case of the Empress of Japan, literally it's a void. There never will be anything. It makes research tricky, but then you start kind of finding it from the outside in. And in the case of Svetlana, she wrote 3 memoirs at least. The last one was only published in India, actually. The first one was very good, and it was a book that she brought with her in her suitcase, unpublished, when she defected. It was sort of the currency, actually, my father was part of publishing it. And then each one got less good, less truthful, a little crazier. And so you begin to find different ways of looking, but there was enough room, I felt. Just to give an example of a case where I didn't feel there was enough room, I was obsessed when Bernie Madoff was arrested with that story. I just thought, how do you get from 1956, Laurelton, Queens, this sort of Jewish idol in New York City, outer borough, when Ruthie at 13 meets Bernie, who's 16 and a lifeguard, to the suicide of Mark Madoff in 2010. And I just thought that is an unbelievable, tragic American story about capitalism and greed and family. And I started reading every single thing I could. And about 6 months later, I just looked around and I thought, there are too many footprints. Diana Enriquez had obviously written Wizard of Lies, and I just didn't feel enough room to be able to imagine. And so I let that sit, and then, a year or so later, I heard HBO was going to do the book, and I just called my agent. I said, just get me in the room. You have no idea how much I know about this. And but when I met with De Niro, and we talked about pitching the show, I just said, we have to understand we're never going to know who Bernie Madoff is. And that is the difference in my mind between writing, a series or a movie and writing a novel. Mm-hmm. You don't write the novel if you're never going to know who that person is. Well,
it's interesting because with real figures, right, you are never going to know who that person really is. And even in researching, going through their diaries, right, there's self-delusion, there's lies that people will perpetuate about themselves, even not realize that they're not true. But when you create a character, you do know that character, right, better than anyone else, because that character is your own. And I'm curious to hear about, like, when you are thinking about the sort of beginnings of your novel, is it the time and the place that comes first to you? Or is it the character? Do you think, I want to set something here and then I want to set my character within it? Or is it that you've thought of these characters and this just happens to be the time in which they live?
For me, it was both geography and character. So I really believe that geography is a character in the kind of novel I want to write. I believe in that phrase, geography is destiny. It's been true in my life and that of my parents. Every move changed our destiny. But I also, the characters I had in mind were strong women like my grandmother. So those were the two things, the only two things I really had at the outset of this novel. And the knowledge that since they were married around 1900 or so, that was the sweep of time, 1900 to 1970, that I wanted to take on.
Well, just quick follow-up on that, and then we'll get to you. But did you sort of deliberately want to avoid talking about more contemporary India, which we know there's a lot of politics involved when you write about contemporary India?
No, not really. I think this was very much a decision to it all began with my mother leaving a wonderful document for my niece, who was 5 years old at the time, describing what her world was like when she was 5. And it just reminded me of what a sort of beautiful moment in time that was, before there was electricity or running water, and yet such rich lives in this insular community of ours. So it wasn't a decision to avoid modern India as much as it was that I stumbled onto this beautiful setting, I thought. So, I mean, I don't think I would be as willing to take on modern India, having not lived there continuously for a while. And this was a fascinating period of time, 1900 to 1970, 2 world wars, the liberation of India after 150 years of occupation, and medically, which was also what interested me, tremendous, breakthroughs. And one of the joys in my medical career has been that opportunity to watch something we only had a name for become something that we understood better at the cellular level, then at the molecular level, and then we have a treatment. And I needed that sweep of time to be able to play with that kind of an idea.
Yeah, it's a history of medicine, isn't it?
In a sense it was, yes, yeah.
Gosh, I've forgotten the question now. What are
well,
we
so
about?
it's about the character versus the setting,
That's right.
because I think for you did want to write specifically about this time and place, right?
It depends. They seem to be, my historical novels seem to be a very personal quest to answer a question that has come to me. What would I do? How would I survive? How does memory sort of play into all of this? And with the women in particular, I was a child during the Vietnam War, and it had a profound impact on me, even as a child. And my best girlfriend at the time, her father was a pilot who was shot down. And so we wore these, POW bracelets, which figure in the book. And so his name and the date he was shot down was on my wrist starting from the age of 9. And the idea was you would wear these bracelets until he came home. And he never came home. And so I wore it, all through college and law school and beyond. And so even when the era ended and, we went back to ordinary life and the war was over, his name was always on me. And I saw how the vets were treated when they came home. And because a lot of them were my, friends' dads. And so it just stayed with me for a very long time, the chaos of that time and the division. And I always wanted to write about it. I first pitched this novel, you and I were talking in the green room. I first pitched this novel in 1997 to my editor, who I was then at Crown. And she had been at Berkeley in 1968. And she said, honey, you're not ready, and the country isn't ready. So, come back when you are. And so it stayed with me always. And then, once I got into historical novels, it was the first thing really that I wanted to write. But by then I was still, very aware that this was not a topic that people wanted to read about. And I was sort of, trying to find my way in. And that was 2020 when COVID hit. And I was watching the news and I was seeing what you were talking about, what's going on in our country. And it felt so familiar.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, it started me, thinking about Vietnam. And then I was watching the nurses and the doctors in the pandemic. And I was seeing the sacrifice that they were making, the price that they were paying, and feeling that they weren't always getting the support that they needed. And for me, that was just this moment where, okay, I don't care if anyone wants to read about the nurses of Vietnam. I want to tell their story. And then, of course, when I started the research, I mean, it was just so compelling and heartbreaking, and I felt important. And so I just sort of dove in. But the difficult part about this book historically was the burden that I felt as a novelist, which I had not felt before. You know, this idea that these veterans and their families had been forgotten for so long and had been, in so many cases, suffering in silence. And so here I was going to take it on, and I wasn't really a member of that generation. I don't come from a military family. So it was, it was a big undertaking to tell this story and to try to tell it both authentically and truthfully, which aren't always exactly the same thing.
And you did.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, one of the interesting things and most powerful things about the women is that it's such a tumultuous period of history, obviously, and you so effectively show the evolution, not just this movement in history, but really the evolution of this young woman, Frankie, and the way in which her character really changes in response to the events that are taking place. And I was struck by something that Margaret Atwood said last night about how when she always thinks of people, she thinks, oh, okay, in 1921, then you're 10 years old and you're in 1931. And I'm curious if either of you ever think in those terms, like, okay, if it's this year, then this is how old you are and this is the person, and whether you even consciously mapped that out. How did you?
I absolutely do. I mean, and one of the things I was so aware of with this character of Frankie is that, she's in high school in the late 50s and she lives through the 60s, and the change that took place in that era for women in terms of the expectation and the women I talked to, they all said, even if they were in college, they were really raised to be wives and mothers. They could be nurses, they could be teachers, and so there was this narrow sort of path for women. And then along come the 60s and sort of, blow it open, but it doesn't necessarily blow it open for your parents or your family. And so, it was this struggle of going from a 1950s woman of conformity to, a woman who has survived war and has come home and then been really not only not thanked for her service, but sort of disparaged for it. And, came home with undiagnosed PTSD, which so many of them did, unable to get help, and told repeatedly, A, you weren't there, and if you were there, you certainly can't have suffered emotional trauma because you never held a gun. You weren't in combat. And so there was just so much change going on. And as a novelist, I mean, it was wonderful. But the historical aspect and the time and place aspect, I didn't want to show just one part of the story. Because I felt, like there's a bunch of protest in the book as well. And I wanted to say that was important. And all of the struggles going on were important. The key is to get past it.
I was very struck by Peggy's sort of graph that she makes for any story. And I just thought that rings true. It makes sense. We're always trying to locate ourselves in history and in time. We're moving through this continuum, and we need to do that with our characters, or else we can't find them and they can't find themselves. The two things I wanted to say that you both were talking about that made me think. One is about this notion of having, especially as we get older, stories that we've been sitting with. They may be partial fragments, but ideas and feelings, and then we just know we're not ready to do it, or it's not the right time, and years go by, but it's still sitting there, and then eventually it comes to the surface. And I do think that there is this natural connection between history and the imagination. Why do we create things? Why do we tell stories? And we are, again, trying to make sense of the time. And even as it takes time to do that, time is passing beyond us. And so the stories ultimately, hold all of that if they're full, by the time they're done. And so this, going back to this notion of historical fiction, I mean, it's already, like, we're already talking about a story that came to us 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And you can try and contemporize it if you want to, but that feels sort of artificial. The other thing I was saying, which comes from something Abraham was remarking on, is, when I was coming out of college, lots of talk about the great American novel. Let's give us a novel about the way we live now, to quote Trollope, and all of that. But since the age of social media and the age of Twitter, now known as X, I mean, to tell us a novel, give us a novel about what it is really like to be around right now and the social issues at hand and all that. I mean, it seems ever more, fictitious, if you will. I mean, how does that happen with all of these different stories going around? I'm a little more skeptical, and so it seems to me that the historical novel, which phrase I tried to kill earlier in the conversation, becomes more and more a way of trying to understand how we got here in the first place. Because trying to grasp this buzzing insect as it's going by your head in a novel, I don't know, I haven't seen it yet.
So the question of research has come up a little bit, and I feel like we need to address it head on. I was having drinks last week with Amor Towles, the author of A Gentleman in Moscow, and yes, we had drinks in a hotel lobby, but it was the Chelsea Hotel.
And I should add, we've tried many times to get Amor here, but he has a thing he does with his family in July, so we're working on it.
Yes.
Okay.
So I asked him, of course, about research because I was, that's immediately what comes to mind. Did this hotel really exist? One of the interesting things, just a quick digression, talking about the insertion of real characters that he mentioned, before I had drinks with him, I, of course, Googled him, as one does, and there was a little thing on his Wikipedia page about, and it turned out to be true, shockingly, but that said that he had put a message in a bottle when he was about 10 years old, and that the person who wrote back to him was Harrison Salisbury, who was the managing editor of the New York Times. And they began this correspondence, and he then inserted Harrison Salisbury, if you go back or you remember the novel, A Gentleman in Moscow, he inserted him into the novel, but in a pretty fictional way. So one of the things that Amor told me that I thought was really surprised me, I asked him, well, how did you do your research? And he said, I did absolutely no research before I wrote my book. I did no research, and I was like, how is that possible? But he worked from what he had already known and what fascinated him about that period, and he wrote the whole thing. And then he did the research, and he went back, and he edited, and he changed it to comport with what does the Piazza and the Hotel Metropole really look like, et cetera. And I'm curious about how you approached research with your books.
Yeah, I think I did a lot of research. In fact, I think research is an excuse not to write.
I was thinking the same thing.
There's a point where you simply have to stop and just start writing. But nevertheless, I think I was very anxious about the fact that I was setting a novel in my Christian community in South India, which is a very small community, and they're also very critical. I always think they were very much like, our parents are very much like Jewish parents. If you become president and your mother's in the inauguration audience, she'll, and someone congratulates her, she'll say, yes, but he could have been a doctor. But not having been born in Kerala, even though we visited a lot, my brother's in the audience, and he and I have fond memories of going back to our grandparents, I really felt that I better get this right. And so I did a lot of research on Kerala. I got a lot of authorities to help me out. And, to go back to something Margaret Atwood said, I had tables. One table was the lives of my family, because I could connect to that. I could imagine my grandmother's birth and her marriage and the years that I knew her. And then I had another column of events in India, social events, political events, another one of world events, another one of medical events. And at every point in the narrative, you're making sure that all these things line up, that you don't introduce a medical advance that hasn't existed, and so on. So I think the research was fun. The writing was necessary, not as much fun.
You do have to write in order to have a novel.
Exactly.
Yes, unfortunately. Because really, once you start researching, you tell yourself, I'm working. You know, it's great. You can keep going and keep reading and keep reading, taking notes. I usually stop researching when I get to a point where I'm taking no notes. You're always afraid that there's a research book that for some reason you have not come across that, you know, changes everything. But I do it very much like Abraham does. I'm very methodical. I have notebooks. It's all in order. I have index cards. And the biggest risk for me is I'm really editorial. I throw a lot away. I write, you know, lots of different versions of the same book. And so it's very easy for me to like take a scene and move it to a time period where it doesn't work anymore and I forget. And so I have to, you know, go back through and like you said, just go point by point by point. But really the point is, I like to say I do the research so you don't have to, because my job is to take all of that information and make it feel seamless in a way. It just becomes then world building.
Yeah, I thought that was so right before we started, Kristin mentioned that this world building, right, which is something that we tend to think of as applying to fantasy novels, right? Because you have to create, you know, this planet and the rules of the magic and dragons or whatever else. But there is world building, right, involved with what you do.
I think it's the cornerstone, honestly, because we are inviting you into a world that we see. And yes, it's historical, and, you know, yes, it's rooted in fact, but there's also this, it has to be immersive. And full immersion is, I think, really related to specificity and to concrete detail that people can really sink their teeth into.
Hilary Mantel, you know, rather famously said that she never would never change a fact to be a part of her story, and that she was absolutely everything, all the facts in her work had to be true. And she would claim that she was sort of the only one in that camp. I think there are, again, there's the sort of the structure of the history itself. You're not going to change time if you're writing realistic fiction. There's a set of train tracks, if you will. But to me, that research is sort of the macro research, and not the part that gets our hearts beating, you know, so fast. It's the details. It's the small things. It's the evocative nuggets that, for us, allow us to enter into the interstices, right, of history. So Novalis said, you know, novels arise from the shortcomings of history. And, I mean, we're storytellers. We tell lies. There are different kinds of lies, though. I mean, there are purposeful, you know, knowledgeable lies, if you will, that are told in the subject of the story. And those are very different from mistakes, right? A bad lie is a mistake. And the reader comes across it and kind of something goes off and you're like, huh? That doesn't sound right. And the world begins to shatter. Mm-hmm. Whereas the great detail is something, you know, at least from my point of view, is something that sets off a chain reaction of reactions on the part of the characters you have created that allows a story to begin to happen within the frame of a known history.
But it's interesting because you can also play with that known frame. So when I was beginning your book, I came to it, of course, with my expectations, very Western expectations, you know, nothing I can do about that, about what is an arranged marriage. So I begin, and the original Mariama, or big Amachi, as she becomes known, is getting married in an arranged marriage when she's 12 years old, or 10 years old. Was she 12 or 10?
12.
12. And I thought, well, this is going to be a disaster, of course, and he's going to be horrible. And then you completely upended my expectations.
Yeah, I think that's a great example of trying to be true to history, but taking a great risk by beginning with that. And yet it was actually the reality of my great-grandmother, who I never knew, was married at 12 to an older widower, and he had a couple of children already. And he, gave her the time to mature, and in time they turned out to have by all accounts, the most wonderful marriage. She bore him a lot of children. Both my grandmothers married at about the same age, but they married 12-year-old and 11-year-old boys. They just became, children in a big household, and their mother-in-law became the closest person to them. So trying to tell the story in a way that doesn't turn off Western readers who compromise the bulk of your readers was challenging. And so you're trying to play against the grain of their beliefs and their expectations. And yet you're being true to the times and showing that out of these inauspicious beginnings, good things can happen.
Both of you killed a lot of characters in your novels, like really, against all expectation. And, everything was supposed to be happily ever after with several people in the women. And I'm curious what goes into that decision about when and how to kill a character.
I'm now feeling like I should have killed more.
Right.
I don't know what. Anyway,
It's the secret.
Okay, it's the secret.
There have been times that I knew before going in that I was going to kill characters. I wrote a book called Nightingale a few years ago, and the way I framed it was an old woman is telling the story of her past, and it's one of 3 characters. And I made a very conscious decision not to decide who that woman was until I wrote the epilogue. So I wrote the entire book as if it could be all 3. And that was really, I think, to keep my interest and to make sure that I didn't stack the deck, in any way. So I always knew I was going to do that. Sometimes in other novels, which for spoiler reasons I won't mention, but sometimes for me it comes down to if I want to make a really, really powerful point and I want to sort of make it memorable and make it powerful, sometimes good people don't survive. And that's part of the message. And I think from a pop psychology sort of thing, I lost my mother when I was when I was young in college, and it had such a profound impact on me that that grief and women and motherhood and sisterhood is all kind of, I think, tangled up together. And I'm constantly reworking my own. Instead of therapy, I write novels.
Yeah.
And I don't think that I was gratuitously killing anybody or
It was still sad.
in life or in fiction.
Yeah.
But I think I was being true to the times. Both my grandmothers lost their oldest sons, in one case their only son, one to typhoid fever and the other to rabies. My father, who's 97 and very much alive, has a vivid memory of his older brother fending off a dog that came into the compound, and he was 16, and then in a month developing an encephalitis that was rabies. So all the deaths in my novels really were true to the times. There was a lot of mortality, and I think maybe as a physician I'm less shy about talking about it, because I think it makes life more poignant to be very aware that life is a terminal condition. I hope this is not news for you.
No, it's interesting. On the hike yesterday morning, I was talking with other writers, and we were asking why there are so many great doctor novelists. And I thought, well, it's because one of the big questions that all of us wrestle with is life and death, and who knows it better than doctors. And I thought maybe it's in practicing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, maybe in practicing medicine and that you are dealing with these incredibly big questions and heavy issues. And I wonder if writing is a way to almost work out some of that.
I will say we who are not doctors are incredibly jealous. I mean, honestly, I'm not kidding. But, I mean, the idea that you're living in that space and seeing people right up to the edge of life and understanding the stories that go into that and trying to help people negotiate that and deal with it. There are no bigger stories, in a sense, than that.
I think a lot is made of that, and I think it's true. We have a ringside seat at many dramatic events, but that said, as you know, with the talent I'm sitting with, that alone is not enough. You have to be able to take that and translate it into something that has broad appeal. There are many physicians who have novels in them, and many of those novels should probably stay in them, unless you're willing to take the time and exercise the discipline to bring those out. So I wouldn't make too much of any advantage that physicians have. But we certainly have a privileged place to watch a lot of drama unfold.
So all three of you have written, this is my last question because we are officially out of time, but I can't help ask this. You've written novels that take place in recent history, and all authors know that the book does not end when you finish writing. It has a whole afterlife. Here is a prime example of the afterlife of a novel. But with historical fiction, there are people who experience these eras that I'm sure you're encountering at places like this and with your readers and hearing from them. And I'm really curious what you've heard of from readers who went through these experiences. I guess 2 burning questions, and then we can go around with you, KRISTIN. I'm really curious how many people you've heard of who were in Vietnam and were nurses or were soldiers, and then John, I have to know, did you hear from anyone who knew those 2 women? So I don't know, KRISTIN, let's start with you.
In all the years of my career, I've never seen anything like the response that this book evokes. I mean, even at my signing yesterday, there were several women who came up and, their fathers were in Vietnam and they had passed away. One of them, her father was an army surgeon, and he came home really damaged, and it broke up their marriage, and I believe he ended up homeless. And she said her mother has been angry all these years, and they read the women together and finally sat down and had a conversation about why he came home the way he did and why he wouldn't talk about it. And I mean, it has been an unbelievable response, and I think it's less honestly about the book and more about the fact that these people are in their 70s and their 80s, and they have been keeping these stories secret. And I think it is so important in life, you're talking about storytelling and sharing, to keep your family stories intact and to tell them to each other and to pass them along. And so I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this conversation among families that were, damaged by this.
I think, Bruce, briefly, I mean, Svetlana was a very complicated character, especially for people who had left Russia or stayed there and eventually got out. And so I did occasionally hear from somebody who experienced the book so intently that the idea that she had been humanized to the extent that as a whole character was very difficult for them. On the other side, my dad was the guy whose opinion I was a little hesitant to receive, and he read it, and then a couple of weeks passed by. I was waiting by the phone, and he just called and he said, "Yeah, that was her." So, I mean, it wasn't, but I'm glad he thought so. Yeah.
I've heard from lots of different readers, and it just sort of echoes the theme we began with, which is, when you tell a good story, even if it's very specific in a very foreign locale, there are archetypal true things that emerge that resonate for us all across cultures. And I think that's the great joy of writing and of novels, that it expands our worlds. We live larger lives than the regular paths we walk by entering the world of a novel. And So to hear from readers about that is always gratifying.
Well, I have to say that was the great success of all of your novels and the joy. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you,
being on
Pamela.
this panel.
That was great.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, guys.
A text you.
Ah, we made it.
Fun.
Oh,
Yeah,
we survived.
you're right. Yeah.
Yep.